I want to comment a minute before I talk about the individual amendments. I also ask unanimous consent that that amendment be considered as read.
Objection.
On the process that we've seen, we're going to have several amendments. This is well in excess of $1 trillion in spending. We've had 4 amendments voted on, and I think unanimous consent will give us 7 or 8 more. So we're going to have a total of 12 amendments. All but the first one was tabled, was not tabled, but we're at 60 vote margins, which is fine. But for a bill that spends $1 trillion to choke down the Senate in a way that does not allow either side the appropriate opportunity to impact $1 trillion worth of spending doesn't fit with either the culture or the history of the Senate, and certainly doesn't fit with the agreement going forward and the rules changes that we had this year. On a bill that has $1 trillion worth of spending, in past history, if you look at the 104th, the 105th, the 103rd Congress, bills of that size would have 70 or 80 amendments. And we're going to choke down to 11 or 12 amendments on this. And the question is, why would we do that? Why would we limit the discussion and the division of thought manifested through votes for the American people to actually see what we're doing? And there's only really 2 reasons why this is happening. One is, and from a phone call with the President, is his own words, he wants sequester to hurt. Now, think about that for a minute. He's my friend, and I challenged him on that when he said it to me. But there's a philosophical divide in this country. The federal government over the last 10 years has grown 89%, while the average median family income has declined 5%. And the reason my colleagues want sequester to hurt and be painful is they want to rationalize that bigger government is better and that we can't afford to cut a penny out of the federal budget. And so what we do is the federal government doing less with more money, while every American is doing more with less money. I would tell you that goes against the greatest tradition of our country. It also is a prescription for failure for our country when we're willing to sacrifice in the short term direct benefits to major segments of our population for a political point. Nobody's done more oversight on the federal government than I have in the last 8 years. And I will tell you conservatively, out of the discretionary budget, $250 billion a year is spent that does not positively impact this country in any way. And yet we can't get amendments up to demonstrate that. Not only can we not have an amendment up, we can't even spend the time on it to have a real debate about it. Because they really don't want to debate these issues of waste, duplication, fraud, and inefficiency. And then the second reason that we're not having amendments, or we're having amendments at 60 votes, is to cover the political cover. Our country's in so much trouble, it shouldn't matter what party you're in. What should matter is, are we fixing the long-term problems of our country in such a way as that we secure the future of our country? And what we've seen through this process of last week and this week is a focus on the short term, a focus on the politically expedient, a focus on the parochial, and from both sides of the aisle. This is not just Democrats, this is Republicans too. Senator Ayotte can't even get an amendment to eliminate spending for a missile program that's never going to be built. It is never going to be built, but we're going to spend $360 million on it next year. because it's a parochial prize to a member of the Appropriations Committee. Washington is not sick because it's partisan. Washington is sick is because it's political and it's short-term in its thinking. Nobody in their right mind, no matter how much it benefits their state, would say they want to spend $380 million or $360 million, I'm not sure the exact amount of money, on a program that's never going to come into fruition unless they're thinking about them and not our country, and not the families of our country, and not the programs that have to be reformed to save them. Nobody would do that. And yet we have 60 votes on all these amendments we're going to offer, because they're going to offer protection for people to vote on them to know that they won't even pass. But you can still get the cover of vote. I voted for it, but it didn't pass because it has to have 60 votes. And that's the smallest part of the problem. And to have to go through what we've gone through over the last 5-6 days and only have had 4 votes says something about this place. And I would just proffer that I bet had we had an open amendment process, we would have been finished with this bill yesterday. If everybody could have, when I came here the first 2 years, you could offer an amendment for anything at any time at a 51 vote. And so all this time we've wasted in quorum calls or on speaking on issues that have nothing to do with the bill in front of us is because we really don't want to govern. What we want to do is we don't want the body to do its work and have the input of both sides into a bill other than in the committee. What we want is a fixed outcome that will allow the administration to make sequester as painful as it can be. And so when you shut down packing plants, when the USDA says they cannot have food inspectors there, at the same time the USDA is advertising for social service workers and event planners, which if you didn't hire them could at least give you 52 people not being furloughed for a week. So what's happening to America today is we're focused inward on the politics and rather than our country. We're focused on gaming the system rather than governing. We're focused on all the wrong things because it's all about the next election. And we've got our eye so far off the ball that we now play every bill that comes to the floor has to have essentially a rules committee of one, which is the majority leader, deciding whether or not he wants his members to vote on a bill. That doesn't have anything to connect with the history of the Senate. This is no longer the greatest deliberative body in the world because we don't deliberate. We don't have an open amendment process. We're too afraid of our own shadows to cast a vote and think we might have to defend it. Well, if you can't defend any and every vote in this body, you don't have any business being here. And to stifle debate and to limit amendments in the way that this bill has done certainly won't breed any goodwill going forward, and certainly doesn't do the due service that American citizens are due. Mr. President, I'll now take some time to talk about the various amendments that I've called up. Amendment 69 was the first amendment I called up. And as the ranking member on Homeland Security and the ranking member on the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, what we know is the Homeland Security and its grants program through what is the Urban Area Security Initiative is out of control. They haven't prioritized their funding. They haven't put metrics on their funding. They haven't controlled their funding. We put out a report in December of 2012 called Safety at Any Price, and we highlighted the problems with this particular grant program. No clear goals. DHS has not established any clear goals for how the funds should be used to improve national security. The 9/11 Commission warned against DHS spending becoming pork spending. USAI, this Urban Area Security Initiative, has become another pork barrel program providing public safety subsidies to cities like my home state, Tulsa. Third is what we found was tremendous amount of waste in these grants. The lack of clear goals has led the state and cities to use this funding on wasteful projects, including paying for overtime for employees, purchasing computers, printers, televisions, underwater robots, bearcats, all the things that don't have anything to really connect to national security and the prevention of terrorism. What this amendment does, it's prohibit $500 million allocated for the UASI grant program that have been wasted on items that do not improve Homeland Security. Specifically, it prohibits the funds from being spent on overtime, back pay, backfill pay, securities at Major League Baseball parks, spring training camps, attendance at conferences, and to purchase flat screen TVs. The other thing we found in our report is the Department of Homeland Security doesn't know what this money was spent on. So not only do they not have goals and metrics for what the money is supposed to be spent on, they can't tell you what it was spent on because they don't actually have any record of it. We've spent $35 billion in total on all DH grant programs since 2003. We've spent $7.1 billion on this program. And what I can tell you is it has helped some communities. I don't doubt that, especially during our tough times. It has filled in. But we need, if we're ever going to get out of the problem that we're in as a country, in terms of our debt and deficits, we have to have programs that have metrics on them. They have to be followed up. The grants have to be followed, and they need to be held to account. So I hope my colleagues, I have no hopes of this passing because most of the colleagues won't actually look at the research that's been done on this, won't look at the ineffectiveness of it, won't look at the waste, and they'll vote a party line vote to defeat this amendment. We'll get 45 or 50 votes, or 51 or 52, but it'll go down. And so consequently, real problems that have been oversighted by the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation, really oversighted by the Department of Homeland Security, the real solutions to problems won't happen because of the way this place is being run. And next, I'd like to talk about Amendment 93. Amendment 93 follows a recommendation of the President. Not my recommendation, the President's recommendation. And what this amendment would do is actually take money that has been directed for expired heritage area authorizations that weren't any recommendation of the President. Actually, the President's recommendation was to cut this money in half, and we're going to do exactly that with this amendment. We're going to cut it by $8.1 million. Now, what heritage areas are, and when we started them, the 12 heritage areas that this is about are at least 16 years old, one of them 25 years old. The whole idea behind heritage areas is to fund them with a grant program to get them started and then let them run on their own with state and local funds. They've become a dependency program. And the OMB and the President's budget said we ought to eliminate the dependency of these by trimming back the amount of money. Instead of becoming temporary programs directed towards self-sufficiency, as originally intended, these national heritage areas have turned into permanent entities that continue to grow in number and funding amount. Totally opposite the original authorization's intent. In other words, they're parochial based. Matter of fact, one of them, the John Chafee Blackstone River National Heritage, has existed for more than 25 years. They actually thought the funding might get cut, so they created another way to pay for it, just as the government had intended for them to do. And they've raised the money for this year, but we're going to fund them anyway in this appropriation package, this omnibus appropriation package. It's not really a CR, it's an omnibus appropriation. Of these 12, have already received $112 million, more than half of the total ever spent on national heritage areas. So they've been in existence at least 16 years. They should have become self-sufficient. They need to become self-sufficient, and we ought not to be spending that money. Now, what will we do with the money? That'll transfer to about $6 million, and with that money, we will turn that money into opening up the tours at the White House, opening up Yellowstone National Park and the rest of the parks. We'll be able to take, in terms of the way that money's spent out, $6 to $7 million of this money, and the national parks will open on time. And most of you haven't heard this, but in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and Coding, Wyoming, the citizens of that state are raising private money to plow the snow so that Yellowstone National Park can open on time. Now, I want you to see the contrast on this. Because it's important to their livelihood and their commerce, they're going to sacrifice personally to get that park open on time. At the same time, we're going to send money to 12 national heritage areas that have been dependent on the federal government for 16 years. Tell me what's wrong with that picture. We're going to create dependency, and then we're going to indirectly tax the people of Wyoming so that one of their great areas of commerce and the visitors that come to Wyoming to see Yellowstone Park, they're going to pay for that with their own post-tax money. That can't fit with a vision of America that almost everybody else in this country believes in. It doesn't fit. Other national parks have reported campgrounds that are going to be closing, reduced maintenance. So we're going to take this $6 million and we're going to use it to help open up these parks and allow the Park Service to have the parks open on time. Instead of creating dependency in a program in the original authorization, shouldn't be getting any money now. They shouldn't have been getting any money for the last 10 years. We're going to take that money and do something for the American people. The next amendment is amendment number 65 is modified. And this is one that really gets my goat. The National Science Foundation funds lots of great scientific endeavors in this country. Matter of fact, they have about 4 times as many applications for grants as they have money to give out. But they spend a considerable amount of money doing such things as funding, quote, research in political science. In 2008, they spent $8.6 million funding research in political science, $10.9 million in 2009, $11 million in 2010, $10.8 million in 2011, and $10.1 million in 2012. What this amendment does is prohibits the National Science Foundation from wasting federal resources on political science projects and redirects that to other areas within SF that's going to give the American people a much greater return on their investment. Let me give you some examples of what they're funding. Campaigns and elections, citizen support in emerging and established democracies, bargaining processes, electoral choice, democratization, political change, and regime transitions. All important things if we weren't in a budget crisis and a spending crisis. But tell me whether or not you'd rather have the next new computer chip generation developed through a grant at the National Science Foundation, or want to know how important it is to the American people the actions of a filibuster in the U.S. Senate. Which one's a greater priority? Which one's more important to the further advancement of this country? I guarantee you the former and not the latter. The years hence, we're going to be making a lot of choices about priorities, and every amendment I'm putting out here today is about priorities. Do we fund stuff that does not adequately or accurately help us in the short term in creating jobs, in being wise and prudent spenders of taxpayers' money? Or do we fund things that are low priority and let things that are high priority suffer? And that's basically what this amendment does. It says, until we get out of this pinch, we shouldn't be spending money to, for example, the $251,000 used to study Americans' attitudes towards the U.S. Senate. So we spent $250,000 last year studying Americans' attitude toward the U.S. Senate. $106,000 to study the candidate-centered elections over those dominated by political parties. $47,000 to study Americans' president's level of cooperation with Congress through their when they utilize executive orders. $28,000 to examine the prohibition movement. You know, it's been a long time since we had prohibition in this country. That has to be a priority for us. How about $250,000 to investigate how people perceive the political attitude of others? That's got to be important right now. It's got to be a priority right now for our country. $144,000 to track how politicians change their websites over time. Who cares? $144,000 will keep a whole bunch of meat inspectors at meat plants. There won't be any furloughs if we get rid of this kind of stuff. So, and I could go on. As a matter of fact, for the record, I will enter all these, what I would consider non-priority studies that the NSF has funded.
Without objection.
And would note, this is where we should be doing our work. We should be making choices for the American people. The hard choices that says this is more important than this, we don't have enough money, we're borrowing $40 million a second, and we're going to fund these kind of political studies that have no benefit except to the politicians, because they're the ones that are going to read them, and the political science professors. The average American doesn't care. But they do care on whether or not their meat's going to be safe and whether or not they're going to get meat. And you mark my words, this amendment will go down. It won't be passed because we don't have the courage to make priority choices in the U.S. Senate. And we don't have the courage to allow amendments such as this, the numbers that should have been 30 or 40 like this, on the floor to make those choices. Finally, Mr. President, I'll talk about Amendment 70. And this amendment's been modified. The appropriators have requested that the Homeland Security related reports that are demanded in this bill, that those reports come to them. And they do appropriate for Homeland Security. But there's an authorizing committee. It happens to be the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. And what this amendment says is, you know, if you're going to give information from the administration to the appropriations, you might want to think about giving it to the actual committee that has the authority to authorize and change the programs. And I would hope that this would be accepted. We're going to get it 14 days after the appropriators. I don't know what that's all about, but I'm willing to concede. I think that Senator Carper and myself ought to see what the administration's saying to the appropriators about programs run in the Department of Homeland Security. So of all the amendments we have, I think this is the only one that has any possibility, and with that, I'd yield the floor.